Welcome to the Mystery and Horror channel. Get ready for dark stories that will give you chills. Before we start, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay tuned for every new mystery. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let's dive into terror. Story 1. The painting in the living room. When we moved to our new house, I inherited an old painting that my grandmother had kept for years. It was an oil painting of a dark forest, with a small, almost imperceptible cabin in the background and a sky heavy with clouds. My grandmother always said the painting was special but never explained why. I hung it in the living room, thinking it would just be another piece of decoration, but soon I realized something was off. From the first day, the feeling of being watched accompanied me whenever I passed through the room. At first, I thought it was just my mind adjusting to the new environment, but the feeling intensified. I would find myself staring at the painting for long minutes, fascinated and uncomfortable at the same time. It was as if the details of the painting subtly changed each time I looked, like the trees in the forest moved almost imperceptibly. During the day, this feeling seemed silly, but at night, it took on a different tone. One night, while watching a movie in the living room, I saw movement in the painting from the corner of my eye. I looked directly at it, and for a second, I swear I saw a shadow among the trees, moving with slow, heavy steps. My heart raced and a chill ran down my spine. I blinked rapidly, trying to adjust my eyes to the dim light, but the shadow had disappeared. The silence in the room became unbearable, and the presence of the painting seemed to fill the space. In the following days, I tried to avoid looking at the painting, but something in me couldn't stay away. The nights grew more unsettling, and the feeling that something was watching me was constant. Then, on one silent night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was like someone lightly tapping on the wood of the frame. I lay still in bed, listening to the knocking that echoed through the house. I grabbed my phone and shone a light into the living room, where the sound was coming from. The painting was there, motionless, but it seemed different. The cabin, once dim and discreet, now had a faint light glowing from the window as if someone were inside. Panic took over me, but still I approached it. That's when I heard a whisper coming directly from the painting, a low, drawn-out voice repeating my name. The shock made me step back abruptly, and I tripped over the rug, falling onto the floor. The whisper stopped for a moment, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying. I got up with trembling hands and turned the painting around, facing the wall, determined to ignore what I had seen. That night, I slept in my room with all the lights on, but my sleep was broken. I woke up several times with the feeling that someone was standing in the hallway watching me. The next morning, when I went down to the living room, the painting was once again hanging properly on the wall, the cabin dark and everything seemingly normal. I couldn't understand how that was possible. I asked my grandmother about the painting's history, and she, with a serious expression I had never seen before, only said, "Some things should remain quiet." Eventually, I decided to take the painting down and store it in the basement, thinking that would solve the problem. But even after removing it, the feeling of being watched never fully went away. On the quietest nights, I still hear those faint taps, as if something or someone inside the painting is trying to call out to me. And at moments of distraction, I feel like the eyes watching me from the dark forest are still there, trapped in the shadows, waiting for another chance to emerge. Story 2. The Night Visitor. I live in an old apartment on the top floor of a building that's over 50 years old. I've always liked the tranquility of living so high up, away from the noise of the street, where only the wind and the distant sounds of the city reached my window. But everything changed on a cold winter night. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was a faint noise, like nails scraping against the glass of my window, a sound that made my whole body shiver. I got up slowly, still groggy from sleep, and walked to the window. The city was engulfed in darkness, with the streetlights casting long shadows on the sidewalks. I looked outside and saw nothing but the void. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it had just been a dream, and went back to bed. However, as soon as I lay down, the sound returned, louder and clearer this time, as if something really was trying to get my attention. This time my heart raced. I sat up in bed, paralyzed, listening to the scratching against the glass in a slow, steady rhythm. I gathered all the courage I had, stood up, and yanked the curtains open, expecting to see a bird or a branch caught in the wind. But to my horror, I saw a tall, thin figure with pale skin and sunken, hollow eyes clinging to the ledge of the window as if it had climbed up there. It watched me with a cold, expressionless smile, its white teeth standing out against the darkness around it. I tried to scream, but my voice seemed stuck in my throat. The figure tilted its head slightly as if curious, and then tapped the glass lightly with its skeletal fingers. The sound echoed in the room and my body froze. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished, disappearing into the night without a sound. I stood still for long minutes, breathing heavily and trying to understand what had just happened. When I finally managed to move, I rushed to the door and checked all the locks, making sure they were secure. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of my room, eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the figure to return. But it did not return that night. The next morning, I went to the window and saw thin marks like scratches on the glass. The fear surged back and a sense of dread washed over me. I told some friends what had happened, but they all said it was impossible for anyone to climb to the top floor. They laughed, thinking it was a made-up story to scare them. But I knew what I saw was real. The marks were there, a silent proof that what I had seen wasn't a figment of my imagination. In the following days, I avoided looking at the window at night, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every time the wind blew and made the curtains move slightly, my heart would race, expecting to see those hollow eyes again. One night, as I tried to sleep, I heard a familiar sound, 2 taps on the window. I opened my eyes immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. I stayed in bed, listening to the sound repeating and feeling the fear turn into absolute terror. Since then, I avoid opening the curtains and always check the locks before going to bed. I know that somewhere, the night visitor is still there, waiting for an opening, an opportunity to return. And sometimes, even in the middle of the city, I feel that the tall, thin shadow is watching me from afar, with that same cold, expressionless smile, patiently waiting for the right moment to reappear. Story 3. The Diary in the Old House. When my family bought an old house in a small town, we were all excited. The house was over 100 years old, with solid wooden doors, tall windows, and ornate ceilings. The smell of aged wood mixed with a faint scent of mold was part of its charm, and the feeling of being in a place full of history was almost magical. During the first week, while cleaning the attic, I found a dusty diary hidden between the floorboards. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting was clear and detailed, as if someone had written it with great care. The diary belonged to a girl named Elisa, who had lived in the house at the beginning of the last century. Her early entries were ordinary, talking about playing in the garden, lessons she learned from her mother, and the company of her cat, Felix. But as I read on, the stories began to take on a different tone. Elisa started mentioning the man in the basement, a figure who, according to her, appeared at night and watched her through the cracks in the floor. At first, I thought it was just the imagination of a child, but the descriptions became increasingly detailed and disturbing. Elisa wrote that the man didn't speak. He only smiled with a smile that wasn't human, and his eyes, deep and dark, glowed like 2 embers in the dark. The last pages of the diary were scribbled, and the letters were shaky, as if she had written in a hurry or in fear. She said the man in the basement called her by name, and that she could hear him whispering incomprehensible things every night. Tonight he promised to show me what's behind the door. If I don't come back, don't look for me. I closed the diary, feeling a chill run down my spine. The air in the attic seemed colder, and suddenly the silence was oppressive. I looked at the basement door at the end of the hallway just below the attic. It was an old wooden door with hinges that creaked whenever they moved. The sight of that door now seemed more sinister than ever. I decided to tell my parents about the story that night, but they laughed, thinking it was just a tale made to scare. They said it was common to find diaries in old houses and that children's minds were creative. That night, I went to bed with a heavy heart, the image of the man in the basement etched in my mind. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound coming from the hallway. They were light, slow footsteps dragging across the wooden floor. My breath caught in my chest and fear kept me frozen. The footsteps stopped in front of my bedroom door, and an eerie silence fell. I strained to hear any movement, but what came next was a low, almost mocking laugh, like someone amused by my reaction. When morning came, I told my mother about the footsteps and the laugh. but she dismissed it as a nightmare. I decided to go back to the attic and reread the last pages of the diary. This time, I noticed something I had missed before, a crude drawing in the corner of the page. It was of a door, and next to it, a tall, thin figure with a face devoid of detail except for the eyes, drawn as two dark, empty dots. Curiosity consumed me, but fear was stronger. I avoided the basement at all costs, but the feeling of being watched never disappeared. Sometimes at night, I still heard those light footsteps in the hallway and the muffled laugh. I never knew if Elisa returned from her visit to the basement, but whenever the house fell into complete silence, I thought of her and the man waiting behind the door, with ember eyes that seemed to never forget who found them. Story 4. The Clock from the Old Shop. When I was a teenager, my grandmother used to take me to an antique shop in the center of town. It was a fascinating place, full of old furniture, rare books, and curious objects, each with its own story. The shop smelled of aged wood and candle wax, and the air always felt a bit heavy, as if the memories of the past lingered there. On one of those visits, I noticed a large wall clock for sale. It was enormous, with a dark wooden frame intricately carved with figures of angels and demons intertwined. The shop owner, an old man with tired eyes, said the clock was very old and that no one really knew its origin. For some reason, I became fascinated by the clock and begged my grandmother to buy it for me. She hesitated, giving the shop owner a concerned look, and he simply nodded as if understanding something I couldn't. That afternoon, we took the clock home and hung it on the wall of my room. It was heavy and had an imposing, almost foreboding presence, but I was excited to have it. However, that excitement didn't last long. On the first night, I heard the faint ticking of the clock, which seemed louder than it should. I closed my eyes, thinking the sound would calm me, but soon realized something was off. Just before midnight, the sound changed. The regular ticking of the clock was replaced by a faint whisper, almost like a voice trying to communicate. It was low and hoarse, as if coming from within the dark wood. I got up from bed and listened more closely. As I approached the clock, the sound stopped immediately, as if it had never been there. I returned to bed, but my sleep was interrupted again when the clock's hand struck midnight. This time, the whisper returned, louder and accompanied by soft tapping, as if something inside the clock was trying to get out. The fear was instant and my heart raced. I turned on the light, and the room fell into complete silence, but the carved figures on the clock's frame seemed different. The angels looked downward with expressions of sorrow, while the demons smiled in a sinister way, as if they had witnessed something amusing. The next morning, I told my grandmother about the sounds I had heard, but she attributed it to a dream or my vivid imagination. Even so, her expression was worried, as if she knew more than she let on. I tried to ignore what had happened and continued with my routine, but the following night brought more disturbances. The whispers returned, and now I could make out words in a language I didn't understand. The room felt colder, and the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. The tapping came from the clock, rhythmic and persistent. On the third night, I woke from a nightmare and looked at the clock. The hand pointed exactly to midnight, and the tapping echoed louder. The carved figures on the frame seemed to come alive, their wooden eyes staring at me. The glass on the clock face cracked, forming a fissure down the center, as if something inside was really trying to escape. I ran to my grandmother's room, breathless, and told her what I had seen. Without hesitation, she grabbed a flashlight and led me back to my room. The clock was there, with a crack in the glass and the figures now appearing twisted in expressions of pain and anger. My grandmother made a protective sign with her hands and said quietly that we would return the clock the next morning. The next day, we went back to the antique shop, and the owner greeted us with a serious expression. He examined the clock, ran his hand over the frame, and muttered something I couldn't understand. "This clock doesn't belong to anyone. It always finds its way back to where it should be," he said before turning his back and disappearing among the shelves. Since then, I have never seen that clock again, but on very quiet nights, I still hear faint ticking and whispers, as if the clock is somewhere, still trying to complete its dark cycle. Story 5. the deserted park. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other and local stories were passed down through generations. One of the most talked about places was the town park, a spot that, during the day, seemed harmless, full of children's laughter and families enjoying the sun. But at night, the park transformed into something completely different. The shadows of the trees grew and stretched, and the wind rustled through the leaves with a sound that resembled whispers. Many said they heard strange things there, and I always thought they were just stories to scare kids. But one night, something happened to me that changed my view of that place forever. It was a Friday night when I was 16. I was walking home from a friend's party, and to save time, I decided to cut through the park. The place was deserted, and the only light came from old street lamps casting eerie shadows on the ground. As soon as I stepped into the park, a chill ran down my spine, but I ignored it and kept walking. The sound of my footsteps was the only noise until a faint whisper broke the silence. I stopped suddenly, trying to listen more closely. The sound seemed distant at first, but I soon realized it was coming from one of the old swings, which was moving slowly and creaking unsettlingly. I looked around, searching for someone, but there was no one. The thin moon in the sky cast a silvery glow on the playground, making the scene even more surreal. I took a deep breath and took a step toward the swing, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But as I got closer, I heard a child's laugh, short and muffled, echoing through the park as if someone was amused at my expense. The sound left me paralyzed. My eyes searched the darkness, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Then the laugh turned into a soft, intermittent sob. The atmosphere around me felt frozen, and the temperature suddenly dropped, making my breath come out in white puffs. The swing continued to move, but now more quickly, as if someone were pushing it with force. I took a step back, my instincts telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. Suddenly, I felt a cold touch on my shoulder. I turned abruptly, expecting to see someone, but there was only emptiness. The laugh returned, louder this time, and it seemed to come from all around. The swing came to an abrupt stop, and a deep silence fell over the park as if time had frozen. That's when I saw a shadow move quickly between the trees, a small, nimble figure that seemed to be playing hide and seek. The adrenaline finally kicked in, and I started running toward the park's exit. Each step echoed, and I could swear I heard other footsteps accompanying mine, light and quick, like those of a child running. When I finally reached the illuminated street, I looked back and saw, for a brief moment, the silhouette of a child standing near the swings, watching me. Its eyes shone silver, reflecting the moonlight. I reached home with my heart racing and told my mom what had happened, and she turned pale. She said that years ago, a child had mysteriously disappeared in the park and was never found. Some of the older residents claimed that the child's spirit still played there at night, looking for company or an escape it would never find. Since that night, I have never set foot in the park after dark. Even now, when I walk by, I swear I can hear the faint creak of the swing and that same laugh, calling out to anyone brave enough to step inside. Story 6. The Light in the Abandoned Lighthouse. In the coastal town where I grew up, there was an abandoned lighthouse that everyone avoided. It sat atop a cliff, with waves crashing fiercely against the rocks below. During the day, it was just an imposing, lonely structure worn down by time, but at night, it took on a different aura. People said that decades ago, a caretaker had mysteriously died there, and its light was still seen flickering even without electricity. No one could explain how this was possible, but I, naturally curious, wanted to see it for myself. One summer night, I gathered the courage and invited 2 friends to explore the lighthouse. They hesitated, but the promise of a supernatural adventure convinced them. The path to the lighthouse was narrow, with loose stones and bushes that scratched at our skin. The moon was high and lit up the silvery sea, but even so, an unsettling feeling hung in the air. When we arrived, the imposing structure seemed to watch us. The broken windows reflected the moonlight, and the sound of the waves echoed, creating a haunting symphony. We entered through the rusty gate, which creaked as if in protest. The inside of the lighthouse was filled with dust, cobwebs, and the smell of salt and mold. Our flashlights cast long, unsettling shadows on the walls. We climbed the spiral staircase, and each step seemed to echo endlessly. As we ascended, the air grew denser, and the sound of the wind whistled through the cracks in the walls like a whisper. One of my friends, Paolo, suddenly stopped and said he felt something strange, like invisible hands touching him. We laughed nervously, thinking it was just fear playing tricks, but in truth we all felt the same. Finally, we reached the top, where the lantern room was. The glass was broken in places, and the view of the cliff and the sea was breathtaking. However, something was off. In the center of the room, where there should have been only darkness, a faint light flickered intermittently, as if trying to fully ignite. We stood in silence, watching the light that seemed to have a life of its own. Suddenly, a low, dragging sound made us turn quickly. It was as if someone was climbing the stairs. Paolo and Lucas exchanged glances, terror clear on their faces. The staircase continued to creak, and heavy footsteps echoed, getting closer. Our flashlights trembled in our hands, and the air seemed to freeze. A chill ran down my spine as a shadow appeared at the entrance to the lantern room. It was a tall, hunched figure with its face hidden in the shadows. The light flickered one last time and went out, leaving us in near total darkness. A low, deep whisper that seemed to come from all around spoke only one word: leave. That was enough to make us run. We stumbled down the stairs, nearly falling, with the sound of our own footsteps mixed with the echo of others that still followed us. When we finally exited the lighthouse, I looked back and saw the light turn on again, glowing steadily as if someone was there guarding the place. We went home in silence, still gripped by fear. That night, I had a nightmare about the lighthouse, where the shadowy figure watched me with glowing eyes that seemed made of light. My friends said they had similar dreams, but no one wanted to talk about it. In the days that followed, the story of the lighthouse became just another ghost tale among the locals, but we knew it was real. I still pass by the coast sometimes, and on the darkest nights, I see the lighthouse light flickering in the distance as if calling me back. And whenever that happens, I remember the low whisper that told me to leave and wonder what would have happened if we had stayed there another minute. Story 7. The House in the Woods. On the outskirts of the town where I grew up, there was a dense forest with trees so old their canopies intertwined, blocking out the sunlight. Deep within this forest, hidden among the shadows, was an abandoned house. People said that years ago, a family had lived there but mysteriously disappeared one stormy night. The stories I heard as a child varied. Some spoke of ghosts, others of strange rituals, but no one really knew what had happened. My friends and I, always eager for adventure, decided to visit the house one autumn afternoon. The sun was already low in the sky, and dry leaves formed a crackling carpet under our feet as we walked through the woods. As we approached the house, the air grew colder, and a thin mist began to form, enveloping the place in an even more eerie atmosphere. The house was large, with broken windows and a door that swung slightly in the wind, emitting a low creak. We entered the house with flashlights in hand, and the floorboards groaned under our steps. The interior was filled with furniture covered in yellowed white sheets that moved slightly with the air currents, looking like silent ghosts. Dust danced in the light of the flashlights, creating an even more unsettling atmosphere. In the center of the room was an unlit fireplace with soot marks climbing up the chimney. The silence was so profound we could hear our own breathing echoing off the empty walls. Lucas, the bravest of the group, decided to climb the stairs to explore the upper floor. I hesitated but followed, with Paolo right behind, gripping his flashlight with trembling hands. Every step we took seemed to protest with a loud creak, heightening the tension. In the hallway on the second floor, a portrait caught my attention. It was a family picture, but the faces were blurred as if they had been erased in a hurry. A feeling of discomfort settled over me, and I began to hear a faint whisper coming from somewhere nearby. Paolo asked if I could hear it too. I nodded, and Lucas pointed to a door at the end of the hall that looked like it led to a bedroom. The whisper grew louder as we approached. The air was heavy, and a cold draft passed over us, sending shivers down our spines. When Lucas turned the knob and pushed the door, it creaked slowly, revealing a dusty room with an old bed and a wardrobe that seemed to have been left open in a rush. Inside the wardrobe, a child's dress hung from a hanger, swaying slightly as if someone had just touched it. Suddenly, the sound of light footsteps echoed behind us in the empty hallway. We quickly shone our flashlights but saw no one. The whisper now seemed to move around us, as if something invisible was watching from all sides. Paolo, his voice shaking, suggested we leave immediately. I agreed, but before we could take a step, the bedroom door slammed shut, trapping us inside. Panic set in, and we started pounding on the door, trying to open it without success. The whisper turned into a low, almost childlike laugh and seemed to come from the wardrobe. We looked at it as the door slowly closed by itself, leaving the dress to fall to the floor. Lucas managed to force the bedroom door open, and we ran down the stairs, out of the house as fast as we could. When we finally reached the woods, we all stopped to catch our breath. No one spoke for a while, but we didn't need words to understand what we had felt. The house in the woods held something that didn't want visitors. We never went back, and even now, when I pass near the woods, I swear I can hear the echo of that laughter, calling to anyone who dares to come closer. Story 8, the basement room. When my family moved to an old house in a small town, I was excited about the change. The house had an old-world charm, with dark woods and intricate handcrafted details. But there was one part of the house that everyone avoided, the basement. It was a large, dark space with a wooden staircase that creaked with every step. My parents said it was just a storage area, but from the first day, something about it made me uneasy. There was a room at the back of the basement that was always locked, and my parents never explained why. One afternoon, while exploring the basement, curiosity got the best of me. The door to the mysterious room looked even more foreboding in the dim light cast by the hanging bulbs. I ran my hand over the cold wood of the door, and to my surprise, the handle turned. The door opened with a creak, revealing a space that seemed untouched for decades. There was an old bed, a rocking chair, and a tarnished mirror in the corner. The air was heavy, carrying a mix of dust and something sharper, perhaps iron. What caught my attention the most was an old notebook lying on the bed. I picked it up and opened to the first page. The handwriting was small and rushed, and the first words made my stomach drop. "This room is not safe. They come at night." The next pages contained scattered accounts of whispers in the dark and shadows that moved when no one was looking. I flipped through quickly, and there was a crude drawing of a tall figure with disproportionately long arms, its eyes drawn as two hollow, dark circles. A chill ran down my spine, and suddenly the sound of something dragging echoed through the basement. My flashlight flickered, and the darkness seemed to move around me. The sound came from the rocking chair, which now rocked slowly as if someone invisible was sitting in it, swaying back and forth. I froze, unable to look away. The door to the room, which I had left open, slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. Panic set in, and I started shouting, pounding on the door. The only response was a faint laugh, distant and childlike, mixed with a deep, drawn-out voice repeating, "You open the door. Now they come." The notebook slipped from my hands, and I caught a glimpse of something moving quickly in the tarnished mirror. A tall, skeletal shadow appeared for a moment, then vanished, leaving an icy chill in the air. With one final desperate push, I managed to force the door open, tumbling out onto the basement floor. The sound of the chair stopped, and the basement fell into an oppressive silence. I ran up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. My parents found me out of breath and shaking, but I couldn't explain what had happened. They looked at me with concern but never mentioned the room again. After that night, I avoided going down to the basement. However, on the quietest nights, I sometimes heard the sound of the rocking chair creaking slowly, as if something was still there, rocking in the dark, waiting for someone brave, or foolish, enough to open the door again. Story 9, the hallway mirror. My great-aunt, a woman who loved antiques, always had curious old objects in her house that drew attention. One of the most intriguing was a tall, narrow mirror that hung in the hallway. Its frame was made of dark wood, intricately carved with details that seemed to form hidden faces among the curves. Since I was young, I always found that mirror strange. When I walked past it, I avoided looking at it for too long, as I felt a peculiar discomfort, like something inside the mirror was watching me. Once, when I was about 15, I stayed over at my great-aunt's house for a few days. She always told me not to play in the hallway at night, but never explained why. One night, I woke up thirsty and went down to the kitchen, passing through the hallway. The house was dark, except for the faint moonlight streaming through the windows and reflecting off the mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move inside the reflection, but there was no one there but me. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and a chill ran down my spine. I tried to ignore it and quickly drank some water, eager to return to the safety of my room. When I passed the hallway again, something felt different. The air was colder and the silence felt heavy. I glanced at the mirror and for an instant, saw a pair of eyes that weren't mine. They were deep and dark, with an expression that combined sadness and something more profound, a restrained anger. I froze for a moment, the water glass nearly slipping from my hand. I blinked quickly, but the eyes had vanished. Taking a deep breath, I ran back to my room, closing the door behind me and hiding under the blanket, as if that could protect me from what I'd seen. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light and my exhaustion, but fear kept me from sleeping. The next morning, I told my great aunt what had happened. She remained silent for a moment, then sighed and sat next to me. She said the mirror had belonged to her grandmother and had always been considered special, though no one ever said why. When she was young, she had also seen figures in the mirror but thought they were just reflections of her imagination. She said that over the years, the reflections seemed to take on a life of their own, so she decided to hang the mirror in the hallway where no one spent much time. That night, I decided I needed to look at the mirror again to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. I waited until everyone was asleep, lit a candle and went down to the hallway. The flickering light cast distorted shadows around the house. I stood in front of the mirror and looked directly at it. For a moment, I saw only my tired reflection, but then, the surface of the mirror seemed to ripple, as if the wood frame itself were shifting. A face appeared behind me, so close I could feel a cold breath on my neck. It was a pale figure with sunken eyes and a crooked smile. The candle in my hand went out, plunging me into total darkness. I heard a soft, drawn-out whisper say, "You finally saw me." I screamed and stumbled back, falling as I tried to move away. The hallway light came on suddenly, and my great-aunt appeared, holding a rosary and staring fixedly at the mirror. The face had disappeared, but the feeling that something was still there, watching, remained. The next morning, my great-aunt covered the mirror with a white sheet and said it was time to get rid of it. I never found out where she took it, but since then, I've always avoided old mirrors. Sometimes, when I pass one, I feel that same cold presence and glance quickly to make sure the eyes I see are only my own. Story 10. The Whisper in the Library. My town had an old library built over a century ago. It was a place of dark stone, with stained glass windows that cast curious shadows when the sun shone through. During the day it was quiet and welcoming, but at night it took on a more ominous air. The dark hallways and tall shelves seemed to hide secrets that only the bravest would dare uncover. The librarian, an elderly woman, always closed the library at dusk and told visitors they should never stay after the sun set. I never understood why until one particular night. I was 17 and studying for my final exams. I stayed late in the library, surrounded by old books and notes spread across the table. The clock on the wall struck 8 p.m., and I realized the librarian had left the keys with me, asking me to lock the door when I left. The silence that followed the departure of the last visitor was heavy, almost oppressive. The dim lights cast dancing shadows on the walls and floor. I should have left, but something inside me urged me to keep reading. About half an hour later, I heard a faint whisper coming from one of the book aisles. I lifted my head, trying to listen. The sound was soft, like a distant voice speaking words I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the window cracks, but the whisper grew clearer, repeating a phrase that sent a chill down my spine. "Why are you here?" I stood up slowly, my heart pounding. The room seemed to grow colder, and the shadows of the shelves appeared denser. I walked down the aisle, lighting the way with my phone's flashlight. The whisper stopped, leaving a silence so deep my breathing seemed too loud. When I turned to head back to the table, I saw a book on the floor that hadn't been there before. It was an old volume with a worn leather cover and no title. I picked it up, and as I opened it, a page fell out. When I picked it up, I saw it was scribbled with hurried words. They lived between the pages, whispering secrets to those who dare listen. A sudden gust of wind swept past me, scattering the papers on the table. The lights flickered, and for a moment, darkness enveloped the room. When the light returned, I saw a tall shadow at the end of the aisle. It had no defined shape, but its eyes, two gleaming slits, stared at me with a paralyzing intensity. The whisper returned, now louder and clearer, "You shouldn't be here." A wave of indescribable fear washed over me, and I ran toward the library door. The lights flashed, and the shadows seemed to follow, sliding between the shelves. I tripped over a stack of books and fell, my phone flashlight rolling away. In the darkness, I heard the breathing of something inhuman, heavy and uneven, coming closer. With a desperate effort, I managed to get up and find the flashlight, pointing it at the empty aisle. The shadow was gone, but the air was still cold and thick with a fear that left me breathless. I reached the door and locked it behind me with trembling hands. When I looked through the window, I saw only the still shelves and the shadows returning to their place. The next day, I returned the keys to the librarian and told her what had happened. She looked at me with a serious expression and murmured, "They've been here longer than us. Respect them and they'll remain silent." Since then, I've never stayed in the library after sunset. When I pass by it at night, I see the shadows of the books through the stained glass and think of the whispers still echoing between the pages, waiting for someone brave enough to listen again. If you made it this far, the mystery has hooked you. So, leave your like, subscribe, and hit the bell to follow each new story. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next terror.